The Hormel family is one of the richest dynasties in the Midwest, but that wealth was paid for with a specific list of casualties. It cost the nervous systems of workers who inhaled liquefied pig brains at a speed of 1,300 hogs per hour. It cost the skin of 13-year-old children scrubbing bone saws with acid at 3 a.m. And it cost the soul of a town crushed by the National Guard. Stop looking at the Spam in your pantry as food. It is a blue and yellow tomb for the American dream. How Spam was born to hide the slaughter. Before the art galleries and the arboretums, there was just the slaughterhouse. George A. Hormel arrived in Austin, Minnesota in 1891 with a cold, simple understanding of economics. Value is extracted by disassembly. He didn't come to build a legacy. He came to dismantle livestock. In the 1890s, meat packing was a visceral, chaotic enterprise, a loud and messy collision between biology and commerce. The early Hormel plant was a place of steam, blood, and screaming, where men stood ankle-deep in the fluids of the animals they were dismantling. George Hormel's innovation was not in the technology of killing, but in the efficiency of waste. He possessed a ruthless eye for the margin. In the traditional butcher shop, parts of the pig were discarded: the feet, the ears, the tails, the excess fat. George saw these not as refuse, but as lost profit. He instilled a culture of total utilization, a philosophy that would later mutate into the company's defining obsession. He ran his factory with the discipline of a Prussian barracks. He knew the yield of every hog down to the ounce. Under his tenure, the town of Austin ceased to be a quiet agricultural outpost and transformed into a company town, a feudal fiefdom where the rhythm of daily life was dictated by the shift whistle of the packing plant. The river ran red, the air smelled of singed hair, and the economy boomed. But George was a man of the 19th century, hard, direct, and unashamed of the blood on his hands. He accepted the violence of his trade as a necessary condition of survival. The psychological fracture that would define the dynasty did not emerge until his son, J.C. Hormel, ascended to the throne. J.C. Hormel was the black sheep of the butcher lineage. Unlike his father, who embraced the grime of the trade, Jay was repulsed by it. He grew up hating the smell of blood and the chaos of the kill floor. He was a refined man who wanted the money but despised the source. This internal conflict, loving the profit but hating the pig, became the driving force of the entire company. He was the Prince of Greece, destined to rule an empire built on dead pigs, yet he despised the sensory reality of his own inheritance. This psychological conflict, the desire for the money but the hatred of the source, became the driving force of the Hormel business strategy. J.C. Hormel sought to sanitize the industry. He wanted to turn the slaughterhouse into a laboratory. He began to hire chemists, engineers, and marketing men, creating a buffer zone of white-collar professionalism between himself and the kill floor. He uncovered an embezzlement scandal within the company in the 1920s, a forensic accounting discovery that revealed a trusted employee, Cy Thompson, had stolen over $1 million. This betrayal hardened Jay. It taught him that trust was a liability and that systems, controls, and rigorous oversight were the only defense against human fallibility. He reorganized the company, tightening the grip of the family over every aspect of production. But his greatest battle was not against thieves. It was against the anatomy of the pig itself. In the Great Depression of the 1930s, the Hormel Company faced a crisis that was both economic and anatomical. As they processed thousands of hogs a day to meet the demand for hams and loins, they accumulated a massive surplus of pork shoulders. The shoulder is a problematic cut. It is technically meat, but it is riddled with connective tissue, gristle and fat. It is tough to chew and difficult to cook. In the consumer market of the 1930s, it was garbage. The freezers in Austin were filling up with thousands of tons of frozen pork shoulders, a mounting inventory of unsold necrotic tissue that threatened to bankrupt the company. George Hormel, the old butcher, might have sold it as scrap or animal feed. J.C. Hormel, the industrial alchemist, demanded a different solution. He initiated a research and development project that forensic historians now view as the Manhattan Project of processed food. The objective was to transmute this biological waste into a premium product. The challenge was significant: how to take a tough, fatty, unappealing cut of meat and make it tender, flavorful, and shelf-stable without refrigeration. The solution lay in chemistry and mechanics. Jay's team discovered that by grinding the shoulder meat into a fine emulsified paste, they could break down the tough connective tissue, but the paste was gray and unappetizing. To fix the color, they added sodium nitrite, a chemical preservative that binds to the myoglobin in the meat, fixing it into a permanent, vibrant pink. This was the birth of the pink slime aesthetic. To add flavor and bind the water, they added salt, sugar, and modified potato starch. But the true genius was the canning process. They developed a method of vacuum sealing the raw meat paste into a rectangular tin and then cooking it inside the can. This process, known as retort cooking, sterilized the contents, killing all bacteria and enzymes. The result was a sterile brick of protein that could sit on a shelf for years, impervious to rot, insects, or temperature. It was the ultimate triumph of man over nature. They had paused the decomposition process indefinitely. However, the product needed a name. Spiced ham was too generic. At a New Year's Eve party in 1936, Jay held a contest. An actor named Kenneth Daigneault, the brother of a Hormel executive, suggested Spam. The name was punchy, modern, and meaningless, a perfect empty vessel for marketing. Jay loved it. In 1937, Spam was unleashed upon the world. The launch of Spam marked a pivotal moment in the history of capitalism, the complete abstraction of the animal. When a consumer bought a steak, they saw the muscle of a cow. When they bought a chicken, they saw the bird. But when they bought Spam, they saw a geometric shape. The pig had vanished. There were no bones to remind the eater of the skeleton, no skin to remind them of the flesh, no blood to remind them of the life. It was a clean industrial object, as manufactured as a spark plug or a bar of soap. J.C. Hormel had achieved his psychological goal. He had created a meat product that did not look, smell, or feel like a dead animal. He had successfully dissociated the profit from the gore. To produce Spam at the scale Jay envisioned, the Austin plant had to be radically transformed. The disassembly line was accelerated. Hormel engineers broke down the butchering process into microtasks. One worker would slash the throat, another would sever the hock, another would scoop the viscera. No single worker made a complete product. They were merely biological cogs in a machine designed to strip the animal to the bone in minutes. This tailorist efficiency had a dark side. It reduced the workers to automatons, forcing them to perform the same repetitive motion thousands of times a day. Repetitive strain injury, RSI, became the phantom plague of the plant, though it would not be medically recognized for decades. The workers' bodies were worn down, their joints calcified, their nerves frayed, all to feed the insatiable demand of the canning machines. The factory floor became a place of deafening noise and relentless speed, a stark contrast to the quiet, air-conditioned offices where Jay Hormel sat, planning his marketing campaigns. The true explosion of the Hormel empire came with the apocalypse of World War II. The United States military needed a protein source that was cheap, transportable, and indestructible. Spam was the answer. The Hormel company secured massive government contracts, shipping over 100 million pounds of Spam to the Allied forces. It became the staple diet of the GIs in the Pacific and the Red Army on the Eastern Front. Nikita Khrushchev later admitted, "Without Spam, we would not have been able to feed our army." J.C. Hormel had inadvertently become the quartermaster of the free world. However, the soldiers hated it. They called it ham that didn't pass the physical, meatloaf without basic training, and special army meat. They resented the monotony of the salty pink brick, but they ate it because it was the only thing that didn't rot in the jungle heat. Forensically, this period represents the global seeding of the Hormel brand. By the end of the war, Spam was ubiquitous. It had penetrated cultures from Hawaii to Okinawa to London. It was no longer just a food. It was an icon of American industrial might. The profits from the war contracts were staggering. The Hormel family wealth ballooned into the stratosphere. They had monetized the global hunger caused by global destruction. As the factory in Austin roared with the production of millions of cans, J.C. Hormel retreated further into his private world. He built a lavish estate, turning his home into a sanctuary of high culture. He invested in an arboretum, planting thousands of trees to create a wall of green between himself and the smokestacks of his empire. He became a patron of the arts, a philanthropist who donated generously to local causes. This was the old money veneer, the charitable washing of the blood money. He wanted to be remembered as a benefactor, not a butcher. But the stress of the double life, the tension between the refined gentleman and the industrial tycoon, took its toll. Jay suffered from health issues, his heart straining under the weight of his own contradictions. He died in 1954, leaving behind a company that was a global behemoth and a family that was fabulously wealthy but ethically unmoored. He had built the machine, but he had removed the human element from its core. He left his heirs a dangerous lesson, that the source of the money doesn't matter as long as the product is clean and the brand is strong. Jay's death marked the end of the founder era and the beginning of the corporate era. He had spent his life trying to hide the blood, but he could not erase it. The blood was baked into the bricks of the factory. It was in the soil of the riverbank, and it was in the legacy he passed down. By abstracting the animal, he had also abstracted the worker. He had created a culture where humans were just another input, another form of meat to be processed. This dehumanization would lie dormant for a few decades, concealed by the post-war economic boom, until the harsh economic winds of the 1980s stripped away the facade. The stage was set for the betrayal at Austin, where the town that built the empire would be devoured by the very machine it helped create. The man who hated blood had successfully turned the pig into a product, but his successors would turn the people into casualties. How Hormel crushed the town that built it. By the early 1980s, the town of Austin, Minnesota, existed in a state of suspended reality, a bubble of blue-collar prosperity that felt immune to the corrosive economic winds blowing across the rest of the American Rust Belt. For nearly a century, the social contract between the Hormel family and the workforce had been absolute, almost feudal in its stability. The workers gave their bodies, their joints, and their loyalty to the slaughterhouse. And in return, the Hormel company provided the highest wages in the meatpacking industry, guaranteed employment, and a sense of shared destiny. It was the quintessential company town, but without the dystopian overtones usually associated with that term. In Austin, working at the pack was not a sentence, it was an inheritance. Fathers passed their spots on the disassembly line to their sons as if they were bequeathing a title of nobility. The parking lot was filled with new pickup trucks and boats. The workers owned lake cabins and sent their children to college. This wealth was the direct result of the profit-sharing model established by J.C. Hormel, a system that effectively made the workers partners in the dynasty. But as the decade turned, the benevolent ghosts of the founders faded, and a new, colder rationality seized control of the boardroom. The era of the family was over. The era of the shareholder had arrived, and it brought with it a forensic accounting of human value that would shatter the town forever. The architect of this new brutality was not an outsider, which made the betrayal all the more intimate and devastating. Richard Dick Knowlton was a local boy, a native of Austin who had started his career working in the hide cellar of the plant, scraping the fat off skins in the freezing dark. He had risen through the ranks, embodying the Horatio Alger myth that the company loved to project. The workers trusted him because he was one of them. He knew the smell of the blood and the ache of the line. But Knowlton had evolved. He had shed the solidarity of the labor floor and adopted the ruthless efficiency of the modern CEO. He looked at the legacy of J.C. Hormel not as a moral obligation, but as a financial inefficiency. In the cold calculation of his mind, the high wages of the Austin workforce were not a badge of honor. They were a liability that needed to be liquidated. Knowlton recognized that the meat industry was changing. Competitors were slashing wages, busting unions, and moving plants to rural areas where labor was cheap and docile. He decided that Hormel would not just follow this trend, it would lead it. He prepared to dismantle the very community that had raised him, proving that in the calculus of modern capitalism, geography and history are irrelevant variables. The forensic context of the conflict that erupted in 1985 is crucial because it dispels the myth of corporate survival. In many labor disputes of the Reagan era, companies demanded wage cuts because they were bleeding money, facing bankruptcy, or struggling to keep the lights on. This was the narrative of the steel mills and the auto plants. It is true that the meatpacking industry in the 1980s was in chaos. Competitors like Oscar Mayer and Rath Packing were slashing wages or going bankrupt to survive the recession. Knowlton argued that Hormel had to follow suit to stay competitive in the long run. But there was a critical difference. Hormel was not broke. In 1984, the company reported a net profit of over $29 million. While other companies cut wages to keep the lights on, Hormel cut wages to keep the stock price up. It was a choice, not a necessity. He demanded that the base wage be slashed from $10.69 an hour to $8.25. He demanded the freezing of pensions. He demanded the rewriting of safety protocols that gave the company more power to speed up the line. To the workers of P9, this was incomprehensible. Why should they bleed when the company was healthy? Why should they give up the middle-class lives they had earned with their sweat when the company was posting record profits? The forensic answer was that Knowlton was not managing for the present. He was managing for the market. He argued that to remain competitive in the future, Hormel had to align its wage structure with the lowest common denominator of the industry. He was effectively telling the workers that their prosperity was an anomaly that had to be corrected. This was the ideology of greed, masked as strategic foresight. The demand was not driven by necessity. It was driven by the desire to maximize shareholder value at the expense of the stakeholder. It was a transfer of wealth from the floor to the vault, executed with the stroke of a pen. The reaction within the Union Hall of Local P9 was a mixture of shock, grief, and incandescent rage. The workers felt a profound sense of cognitive dissonance. They had bought into the Hormel family mythology. They believed that if they worked hard and were loyal, the company would take care of them. Knowlton's demand shattered this illusion instantly. It revealed that the paternalism of the past was merely a fair-weather policy, easily discarded when the wind shifted. The workers realized they were not partners. They were line items, costs to be controlled, biological machinery that had become too expensive to maintain. This betrayal radicalized the Union. Local P9, historically a moderate and cooperative group, transformed into a militant insurgency. They elected a new leadership headed by Jim Guyette, a fierce, unyielding idealist who refused to accept the logic of concession. Guyette and his team hired Ray Rogers, a controversial labor strategist known for his corporate campaign tactics. Rogers did not believe in fighting only at the negotiation table. He believed in fighting in the boardroom and the bank. He targeted the financial institutions that supported Hormel, bringing the war to the doorsteps of the investors. This escalation terrified the International Union, the UFCW, which wanted a quiet settlement, but it galvanized the rank and file in Austin. They began to wear buttons, hold rallies, and paint slogans on their cars. The town began to fracture. The company town was developing a split personality. On one side were the company men, the foremen, the office workers, and the retirees who felt loyalty to the brand. On the other side were the P9 workers, who felt they were fighting for the soul of the American middle class. As the deadline for the contract approached in the summer of 1985, the physical landscape of the Hormel plant began to change, mirroring the darkening mood of the negotiations. The company prepared for the strike not as a labor dispute, but as a siege. Richard Knowlton ordered the construction of an 8-foot-high chain-link fence topped with barbed wire around the perimeter of the sprawling facility. Floodlights were installed to illuminate the grounds at night. Security cameras were mounted on the walls. He hired a private security firm, essentially a mercenary force, to patrol the gates. The plant, which had once been the beating heart of the community, the place where school children took tours to see where Spam was made, was transformed into a fortress. Forensically, these preparations reveal intent. Knowlton was not trying to avoid a strike, he was provoking one. He knew that P9 would never accept the wage cuts. He wanted them to walk out. By forcing a strike, he could legally hire replacement workers, scabs, and permanently break the union. It was a calculated strategy of attrition. He had the inventory, he had the cash reserves, and he had the political climate of Reagan's America on his side. He was willing to starve the workers into submission. The construction of the fence was a powerful visual symbol to the people of Austin. It said clearly and brutally, "You are on the outside. We own the means of survival, and we will lock you out of your own livelihood." But make no mistake, Richard Knowlton was merely the executioner. The Hormel family was the judge. As the majority shareholders, the heirs of George and Jay held the ultimate power. They could have stopped the wage cuts with a single phone call. Instead, from the safety of their secluded estates, they chose silence. They let Knowlton play the villain so they could remain the benevolent aristocracy, quietly collecting the increased dividends paid for by the hunger of their neighbors. In August 1985, the inevitable happened. Local P9 voted overwhelmingly to strike. 1,500 workers walked off the job. The machine stopped. The steam vented into the summer air. Silence fell over the kill floor for the first time in decades, but it was the silence of a held breath before a scream. The families of Austin prepared for a long winter. They stocked up on food. They pooled their resources and they walked the picket line chanting, "No retreat, no surrender." They believed they could win because they believed in the moral righteousness of their cause. They believed that their neighbors would support them. They believed that the Hormel family, the heirs of the benevolent George and Jay, would step in and stop Knowlton's madness. But the Hormel family remained silent. The heirs, living in their distant estates, collecting their dividends, did not intervene. They washed their hands of the conflict, hiding behind the corporate veil of management decisions. Their silence was the final nail in the coffin of the old benevolent order. It proved that the charity and the arts patronage were merely decorations, easily separated from the brutal business of extraction. The strike began with hope, but the forensic evidence of the preparations inside the fortress suggested a different outcome. Knowlton was not planning to negotiate. He was planning to replace the population. He was preparing to import a new workforce, desperate people who would work for less, effectively erasing the generation of men and women who had built the company. The betrayal was complete. The alchemist of pork had turned into the executioner of labor, and the stage was set for the violence that would turn the frozen streets of Austin into a battleground. As the calendar turned to January 1986, the standoff in Austin, Minnesota, shifted from a labor dispute into a theater of psychological warfare, set against the backdrop of one of the harshest winters in local history. The strike had dragged on for 5 months. The savings of the P9 families were incinerated. The food banks were empty. The stress was metabolizing into domestic abuse, alcoholism, and a pervasive, grinding depression. But the resolve of the union remained unbroken. They believed that Hormel, the entity that bore their town's name, would not dare to cross the final line, operating the plant with non-union labor. They were wrong. Richard Knowlton, operating with the cold strategic clarity of a field marshal, decided that the time for negotiation had passed. He issued a directive that would sever the last tendon connecting the company to the community. He announced that on Monday, January 13, 1986, the Hormel plant would reopen. If the P9 workers did not return to accept the wage cuts, they would be permanently replaced. This ultimatum was a forensic turning point. In the history of American labor, the permanent replacement of workers was the nuclear option, a tactic that transformed a strike from a pause in production into a death sentence for the workforce. Knowlton was weaponizing the economic desperation of the surrounding region. He knew that the rural Midwest was suffering from a farm crisis. There were thousands of farmers facing foreclosure, laborers out of work, and desperate men willing to cross a picket line to feed their families. Knowlton invited these people, whom the strikers called scabs, to take the jobs of their neighbors. It was a masterstroke of cynical sociology. He was pitting the desperate against the proud, using the poverty of one group to crush the solidarity of another. The company set up a hiring center, and the lines formed. To the P9 workers standing in the freezing wind, watching strangers sign up for their shifts, it was a violation more intimate than theft. It was the theft of their identity. On the morning of the reopening, the atmosphere in Austin was apocalyptic. The temperature had plummeted to 20 degrees below zero. The air was crystallized, sharp enough to cut the lungs. Thousands of strikers and their supporters from across the Midwest gathered at the gates of the plant. They parked their cars across the entrance, creating a blockade of steel and frozen exhaust. They stood shoulder to shoulder, a human wall determined to stop the scabs from entering the fortress. For a brief moment, it seemed that the sheer mass of humanity would prevail. The plant could not operate if the workers could not enter. But the Hormel Corporation had a powerful ally, the state of Minnesota. In a move that is still cited by forensic historians as one of the greatest betrayals in Democratic politics, Governor Rudy Perpeach, a man elected with labor support, ordered the deployment of the National Guard to Austin. He claimed it was to protect the peace, but functionally the troops were deployed to protect the profit margins of a profitable corporation. The sight that greeted the citizens of Austin was surreal and terrifying. Military jeeps, armored personnel carriers, and transport trucks rolled down the quiet residential streets where children usually rode their bicycles. Soldiers in full combat gear, armed with batons and riot shields, marched in formation toward the picket line. The company town had been placed under martial law. The symbolism was devastating. The government was using the machinery of war to escort strikebreakers into a spam factory. The Guard was not there to mediate. They were there to enforce the will of Richard Knowlton. As the convoys of replacement workers approached, buses with taped-over windows to hide the identities of the passengers, the soldiers formed a phalanx to push back the screaming strikers. The tension broke into violence. Tear gas canisters were fired into the crowd. The white snow was stained with chemical residue and blood. Men and women who had spent their lives making ham for the nation were dragged away in handcuffs, thrown into the back of police vans, their faces pressed against the frozen metal. The betrayal at Austin was no longer a metaphor. It was a physical reality of bruises, gas, and incarceration. The reopening of the plant under military guard introduced a new toxic element into the social chemistry of Austin: the scab. This word, a monosyllabic curse, became the defining label of the conflict. The people who crossed the line, some of them desperate strangers, some of them former union members who had broken under the financial pressure, were marked for life. Sociologically, the presence of the replacement workers destroyed the social cohesion of the town. The anonymity of the factory floor vanished. Now every station on the line was a crime scene. The person working the slicer was sitting in the spot of a man who was standing outside in the cold. The violence shifted from the gates to the living rooms. The names of the scabs were published. Their phone numbers were circulated. They received death threats. Their car tires were slashed. But the psychological violence was worse. In the grocery store, strikers would abandon their carts if they saw a scab in the aisle. In the churches, pews would empty if a replacement worker sat down. Children fought on the playgrounds, echoing the hatred of their parents. The label scab was applied not just to the worker, but to their spouse, their children, and their dog. It was a total social excommunication. Knowlton had succeeded in restarting the machines, but he had turned Austin into a cauldron of paranoia and hatred. The production line was moving again, churning out cans of Spam, but the product was now being made by a workforce that had to be bussed in under armed guard, working in a factory that felt like a prison, surrounded by a town that wanted them dead. Inside the executive offices, shielded from the tear gas and the screaming by the triple-paned glass and the National Guard perimeter, Richard Knowlton watched his plan unfold with grim satisfaction. A closer look at his leadership during this period reveals a man devoid of sentimental attachment to the community that raised him. He viewed the National Guard not as a tragedy, but as a necessary asset protection service. He viewed the scabs not as human beings, but as interchangeable biological units. He calculated that the bad publicity, the images of grandmothers being arrested, of soldiers facing down workers, was a temporary cost. He knew that the American consumer, the person buying the pepperoni and the chili in California or New York, did not care about the misery in Austin. They only cared about the price and the availability of the product. Knowlton's strategy was to grind the Union into dust. He refused to compromise. When the International Union, terrified by the radicalism of P9 and the bad press, ordered the local to call off the strike, Knowlton knew he had won. He had successfully divided the labor movement. He had the state on his side, the law on his side, and the capital on his side. The militarization of the conflict served his purpose. It demonstrated the futility of resistance. It showed the workers that the company was more powerful than the government, more powerful than the police, and more powerful than their collective will. By the end of that terrible winter, the strike was effectively broken, though the official end would not come for months. The plant was running at full capacity with replacement workers. The National Guard eventually withdrew, leaving behind a scarred landscape. The physical wounds healed, the tear gas cleared, the bruises faded, but the forensic evidence of the trauma remained embedded in the psyche of the town. Austin had been subjected to a form of domestic warfare. The old money Hormel family, the silent shareholders, had allowed their hometown to be turned into a police state to protect their dividends. They had watched as their neighbors were gassed in the street. The siege of Austin proved that the modern corporation has no homeland. It has no loyalty to geography. It is an extraction machine that will use the full force of the state to ensure the flow of capital. As the spring thawed the frozen ground, the P9 workers who had held the line found themselves permanently locked out, their jobs gone, their pensions threatened, and their identities erased. They were the casualties of a new economic order, one where the connection between the success of the company and the well-being of the worker was severed by a chain-link fence and a line of soldiers. The militarization of pork was complete, and the stage was set for the final tragic act, the fratricide that would ensure the town never truly healed. When the tear gas finally cleared from the streets of Austin in the spring of 1986, it revealed a landscape that had been forensically altered. The physical violence of the National Guard deployment had ceased, but it was replaced by a form of psychological violence that was far more enduring and intimate. The strike had not merely pitted worker against management, it had pitted neighbor against neighbor, father against son, and brother against brother. This was the phenomenon of fratricide, the killing of the brother, played out not with guns, but with silence, exclusion, and a hatred so deep it calcified into the very architecture of the town. In the sociology of labor disputes, the Austin strike is unique because of the depth of this internal fracture. Because employment at Hormel was often a generational inheritance, many families had members on both sides of the line. One brother might be a militant member of P9, holding the line in the freezing cold, while another brother, facing mortgage payments or simply disagreeing with the union's radical tactics, crossed the line to work as a scab. The consequences of these decisions were immediate and catastrophic for the family unit. Sunday dinners were canceled, weddings were boycotted, funerals became battlegrounds where one side of the family would refuse to sit in the same pew as the other. The label scab became a permanent scarlet letter, a mark of Cain that no amount of time could erase. Forensically, we can trace the disintegration of the town's social fabric through the micro-interactions of daily life. The local bars became segregated. There were P9 bars and scab bars, and crossing the threshold of the wrong one could result in a fist fight. Children in the local schools were bullied based on the choices of their parents. The trauma was inherited. A 10-year-old child didn't understand the intricacies of wage concessions or pension freezes, but they understood that their uncle was a traitor or that their neighbor was a troublemaker. The Hormel company, in its ruthless pursuit of efficiency, had not just broken a union, it had broken the fundamental bonds of kinship that hold a community together. The company town had become a schizophrenic town, possessed by two warring spirits that could not coexist. The ultimate defeat of Local P9 did not come from the company alone. It came from within the House of Labor itself. In a twist that remains one of the most bitter chapters in American union history, the parent organization, the United Food and Commercial Workers, UFCW, turned against its own local branch. The international leadership in Washington, D.C. viewed the radical tactics of P9, the corporate campaigns, the media stunts, the uncompromising stance as a threat to their established order. They preferred the stability of concession to the chaos of resistance. In early 1986, the UFCW officially sanctioned the strike, but then, in a move of stunning bureaucratic violence, they placed Local P9 under trusteeship. This meant they seized control of the local union hall, ousted the elected leadership of Jim Guyette, and effectively ordered the workers to surrender. To the P9 loyalists, this was the Judas kiss. They were fighting a two-front war, one against the corporate greed of Richard Knowlton, and another against the political cowardice of their own national leaders. The Hormel Company capitalized on this division with surgical precision. They used the International's denunciation of P9 as proof that the strikers were rogue extremists, out of touch with reality. When the strike was officially declared over by the trustees, the victory for Hormel was total. They had achieved every single one of their objectives. They had slashed wages. They had gutted the seniority system. They had purged the workforce of the most militant activists. And they had done it all with the tacit blessing of the national labor establishment. The P9 workers who had held out for months were left stranded, their jobs gone, their union hall locked against them, and their sacrifices rendered legally void. Inside the fortress of the plant, a new social order emerged. The workforce was now a hodgepodge of returning strikers who had crossed the line, broken by poverty, permanent replacement workers bussed in from other states, and the old guard who had sided with the company from the start. The atmosphere on the line was toxic. The trust that is essential for a dangerous industrial environment, where men wield knives and operate heavy machinery next to each other, was non-existent. Sabotage became a silent form of protest. Machines would mysteriously break down. Product would be damaged. But the line kept moving. The speed up that Knowlton had demanded was implemented with ruthless efficiency. The new workforce, lacking the solidarity and the protection of the old union, was pushed to the physiological limit. Forensically, this shift marked the transition of Hormel from a paternalistic employer to a modern, metrics-obsessed corporation. The bodies of the workers were now disposable commodities. If a worker burned out, developed carpal tunnel, or was injured, they were simply replaced by the next desperate person in line. The Hormel family feeling was dead, replaced by a culture of fear and surveillance. The company installed listening devices in break rooms. Security guards patrolled the floor. It was a panopticon of pork. The workers who had crossed the line to save their jobs found that they had saved nothing but a paycheck. They had lost the respect of their peers and the dignity of their labor. They worked with their heads down, haunted by the faces of the friends they had betrayed at the gate. For Richard Knowlton and the shareholders, the destruction of P9 was a resounding triumph. In the years following the strike, Hormel's profits soared. The stock price climbed. Wall Street applauded Knowlton's toughness. He was named Man of the Year by industry publications, celebrated as a visionary who had successfully disciplined a recalcitrant workforce and modernized the cost structure of the meatpacking industry. The Hormel family and their distant estates saw their wealth multiply. The dividends flowed like wine, unburdened by the screams from the picket line. But this was a hollow victory. The soul of the brand had been irrevocably tarnished. The Austin Miracle, the idea that a corporation could be both profitable and humane, was exposed as a lie. The victory was purchased at the cost of the town's future. Austin never fully recovered. The high-wage jobs that had supported a vibrant middle class were gone, replaced by low-wage positions that attracted a transient workforce. The tax base eroded. The schools and civic institutions that George Hormel had endowed began to struggle. The city of Spam became a Rust Belt statistic, a place where the American dream had been foreclosed upon. Today, the scar of 1986 is still visible in the forensic topography of Austin. There's a mural in the town dedicated to the P9 strikers, a colorful, defiant image of workers holding the line against the machine. It stands as a memorial to a lost cause, but the true memorial is the silence in the local graveyards, where brothers are buried in separate plots, their estrangement lasting into eternity. The Hormel strike taught the American working class a brutal lesson, that in the era of financialized capitalism, loyalty is a one-way street. The corporation will use the community to build its fortune, but it will burn that community to the ground to protect its margin. The Hormel dynasty emerged from the 1980s, richer, stronger, and colder. They had successfully insulated themselves from the human cost of their business. They had proven that they could crush a rebellion and still sell millions of cans of SPAM. But as the 20th century wound down, a new horror was breeding inside the damp, high-speed environment of their factories. The fratricide had destroyed the social body of the town, but the next catastrophe would attack the biological body of the worker. The speed up that Knowlton enforced would create the conditions for a medical nightmare, a mysterious fog of liquefied brain matter that would turn the factory floor into a neurological kill zone. The violence of the strike was over, but the violence of the production line was just beginning. What mystery illness was destroying the workers' nervous systems? Richard Knowlton prepared the ground for the modern biological horror by slicing the company in two. After the 1985 strike, he built a labyrinthine corporate structure to hide the dirty work. Physically, the Quality Pork Processors QPP plant in Austin, Minnesota, is indistinguishable from the main Hormel facility. They share the same real estate, the same loading docks, and the same stifling, grease-laden air. To an outsider, they appear to be a single organism. However, legally, they are surgically separated by a membrane of liability. QPP was created as a privately held entity to take over the kill floor and the cutting operations, the dirty, dangerous, bloody work of disassembly, while Hormel retained the clean, profitable work of processing, canning, and marketing. This structure was a masterstroke of risk management. It meant that the workers standing ankle-deep in blood were technically not Hormel employees. If they were injured, if they were maimed, or if they contracted a mysterious illness, the Hormel family dynasty was insulated by a layer of corporate paperwork. It was in this shadow factory, this legal phantom zone, that the relentless drive for efficiency collided with the delicate biology of the mammalian nervous system to create a nightmare. The specific crime scene within this complex was a station known colloquially as the head table. In the hierarchy of the slaughterhouse, the head table is the bottom of the barrel. It is the station where the severed heads of the 19,000 hogs killed each day are processed. By the time the head reaches this point, the valuable cuts, the loins, the hams, the ribs, the bellies, have already been stripped away and sent to the Hormel side of the wall to become bacon and spam. The head is waste. It contains the snout, the ears, the cheek meat, and deep inside the armored casing of the skull, the brain. For decades, the brain was largely discarded or rendered into animal feed, a low-value byproduct not worth the labor cost of extraction. But in the globalized market of the 21st century, the logic of total utilization that George Hormel pioneered demanded that even the synaptic tissue of the animal be monetized. There was a growing market in Asia, particularly in China and Korea, for pork brains to be used as a thickener in stir-fries and as a delicacy. The orders came in. The brains needed to be harvested. The engineering problem facing the QPP managers was one of anatomy versus speed. The pig skull is a marvel of evolutionary engineering, a thick calcified helmet designed to protect the most vital organ from trauma. To access the brain using traditional butchery methods involves splitting the skull with a cleaver or a saw. This is a violent, time-consuming action. It creates bone shards, it damages the delicate brain tissue, lowering its market value. And most unacceptably to the modern industrialist, it is slow. It creates a bottleneck. If the kill floor is running at a speed of 1,300 hogs per hour, a speed necessary to maintain the profit margins demanded by the shareholders, you cannot have a worker spending 10 seconds splitting a skull. You need a method that takes less than 2 seconds. The solution implemented at the QPP plant was a piece of pneumatic brutality that forensic engineers describe as a compressed air harvest system, but which the workers on the line simply called the brain blower. The device looked deceptively simple: a stainless steel nozzle connected to a high-pressure industrial air hose, generating 90 pounds per square inch psi of force. The concept was not to cut the skull open, but to turn the skull into a pressure chamber. The worker would take the severed pig head, which was moving along a conveyor belt, and insert the nozzle into the foramen magnum, the large opening at the base of the skull where the spinal cord connects to the brain. Once the nozzle was seated in this neural gateway, the worker would pull the trigger. When the trigger was pulled, a blast of 90 psi air exploded into the cranial cavity. The physics of this moment are gruesome. The air pressure inside the skull would spike instantly. The brain tissue, which has the consistency of soft tofu or custard, would be subjected to a violent concussive force. It would shear away from the dura mater, the membrane attaching it to the bone. But because the skull is a closed container with only one exit point, the pressure had to go somewhere. The air blast would force the brain to liquefy and shoot out of the foramen magnum around the nozzle, effectively blowing the brain out of the head in a single violent pop. The semi-liquid brain matter would splash into a collection bucket, ready to be packaged and shipped to Asia. It was a triumph of industrial efficiency. A process that used to take strenuous effort and sharp blades was reduced to a pneumatic trigger pull. The line could move faster, the yield was higher, the product was visually intact. However, the designers of this system failed to account for the fluid dynamics of high-pressure air hitting soft biological tissue in an open environment. They treated the brain as a solid object, like a piston in an engine. They did not calculate for the aerosolization effect. When the blast of air hit the brain, it didn't just push the organ out, it atomized a portion of it. Every time the brain blower was fired, 1,300 times an hour, shift after shift, it created a microscopic explosion of biological matter. The force of the air sheared the brain cells apart, turning the neural tissue into a fine, invisible mist. This was not merely blood or water vapor. It was a complex slurry of proteins, enzymes, and basic myelin proteins, the fatty sheathing that coats nerve fibers. The environment at the head table transformed into a biological kill zone, though it was invisible to the naked eye. The workers standing at the station, mostly immigrants from Mexico and Central America, who had replaced the P9 strikers, were enveloped in a continuous cloud of this aerosolized brain matter. Forensically, we call this a bioaerosol. The ventilation system in the room was designed to handle the smell of blood and manure, not to filter out microscopic particulate matter generated by pneumatic explosions. The air scrubbers were overwhelmed. The mist hung in the air, a heavy, humid fog that tasted metallic and fatty. It coated everything. It settled on the cold concrete floors, making them slick. It coated the stainless steel machinery in a fine, sticky film. And, most critically, it coated the workers. The men and women at the head table wore standard protective gear, hard hats, plastic aprons, and gloves, but they did not wear respirators. Why would they? They were cutting meat, not handling asbestos or toxic waste. The corporate safety manuals did not classify pig brain as a respiratory hazard, so for 8 to 10 hours a day the workers breathed in the mist. They inhaled the liquefied neurons of thousands of pigs. The microscopic particles traveled down their trachea, bypassing the cilia and the mucous membranes, and settled deep into the alveoli of their lungs. From there, the foreign proteins entered the bloodstream. The workers became living filters for the factory's waste. They were inhaling a biological substance that was evolutionarily similar, yet crucially different from their own biology. The pig brain contains proteins that are nearly identical to human neural proteins. In the chaotic, high-speed environment of the head table, where the noise of the pneumatic blasts sounded like a rhythmic gunfire, a silent biological transaction was taking place. The bodies of the workers were absorbing the essence of the animal they were slaughtering. The line speed was so intense that there was no time to step away, no time to let the mist clear. The workers were essentially submerged in a solution of aerosolized central nervous system tissue. This was the ultimate expression of the Hormel ethos of speed above all. The brain blower was a device born of pure economic rationality. It saved seconds, and in the volume business, seconds are millions of dollars. But by bypassing the slow, safe mechanics of the knife for the violent speed of the air hose, the company had inadvertently turned the head table into a laboratory for a horrific immunological experiment. They had introduced a massive load of foreign neural antigen directly into the vascular systems of their workforce. The neural fog was not just an atmospheric condition, it was a trigger. Deep inside the bone marrow and the lymph nodes of the workers, their immune systems were waking up. They were detecting an invader. And in the tragic confusion of biology, the killer cells were about to receive a set of target coordinates that would lead them to attack the wrong enemy. The mist was settling, and the betrayal was about to begin. The biological horror that unfolded in Austin, Minnesota, did not announce itself with the sudden violence of a factory explosion or a chemical spill. It arrived with the insidious slowness of a creeping rot. Through the years of 2006 and 2007, the brain blower at the Quality Pork Processors plant continued its pneumatic rhythm, firing 1,300 times an hour, pumping the pink mist of aerosolized neurons into the lungs of the workers. Inside the bodies of the men and women at the head table, a catastrophic immunological error was being written into their genetic code. The incubation period was a time of silent accumulation. The pig proteins, having breached the lung barrier, were circulating in the blood, being cataloged by the immune system as a threat. For months, nothing happened. The workers clocked in, stood in the fog, and clocked out. But the threshold was eventually crossed. The immune system, designed over millions of years to protect the body from viruses and bacteria, made a fatal miscalculation. It identified the foreign pig brain tissue as an enemy, which was correct. But in a tragic twist of evolutionary biology known as molecular mimicry, the antibodies it created to destroy the pig brains found another target that looked terrifyingly similar: the workers' own nervous systems. The first symptoms were innocuous, easily dismissed as the standard wear and tear of industrial labor. A worker would feel a strange tingling in their toes, like the static of a leg falling asleep. Then came the burning. It wasn't the ache of a strained muscle. It was a neuropathic fire, a sensation of hot needles pricking the skin of the feet and hands. The workers, mostly stoic immigrants who could not afford to lose a shift, took painkillers and kept working. They assumed it was the cold of the packing plant or the repetition of the job, but the fire didn't stop. It climbed. It moved up the legs, consuming the calves and the thighs. It moved up the arms, turning fingers into clumsy, numb appendages. The phantom fire was the signal that the body's defenses had turned traitor. The antibodies were stripping the insulation off the nerves. By late 2007, the symptoms had escalated from discomfort to grotesque disability. The locker room at QPP began to resemble a ward for the neurologically damaged. Strong, healthy men who had spent their lives doing heavy physical labor began to lose the ability to navigate gravity. The medical term is ataxia, but on the factory floor it looked like drunkenness. Workers would stumble as they walked to the line. Their legs would buckle without warning. They had to hold on to the walls to stay upright. A terrifying fatigue set in, a heaviness that made lifting a knife feel like lifting a sledgehammer. The most harrowing physical manifestation was the change in gait. As the nerves in the legs were stripped of their myelin sheath, the fatty protective coating that allows electrical signals to travel efficiently, the signals from the brain to the muscles began to short-circuit. The workers could no longer feel the floor beneath them. To compensate, they developed a high-stepping, slapping walk, lifting their feet excessively high and slamming them down to get some sensory feedback. It became known as the zombie walk. It was a scene of dystopian horror, a line of workers, surrounded by the smell of raw meat, shuffling and lurching like reanimated corpses, trying desperately to keep up with the relentless speed of the conveyor belt. They were literally disintegrating from the inside out, their own white blood cells devouring the wiring of their bodies. Yet they continued to harvest the brains of the pigs that were killing them. The local doctors in Austin were baffled. They saw a cluster of patients presenting with symptoms that looked like Guillain-Barré syndrome or chronic inflammatory demyelinating polyneuropathy, CIDP, rare autoimmune disorders that typically affect only 1 or 2 people in a population of 100,000. Here, in a single small town, there were dozens of cases. The standard treatments, steroids, rest, did nothing to stop the progression. The paralysis was spreading to the bowel and bladder functions. Some workers were becoming bedridden, their bodies turning into prisons of pain and numbness. Recognizing that they were facing a medical anomaly, the local physicians referred the patients to the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, just 40 miles down the road. The Mayo Clinic is one of the premier diagnostic institutions in the world, a place where the most complex medical puzzles are solved. A team of neurologists led by Dr. Daniel LaChance began a forensic investigation of the patient cluster. They conducted spinal taps, extracting cerebrospinal fluid that should be clear but was teeming with inflammatory markers. They performed nerve conduction studies which showed that the electrical signals in the workers' limbs were moving at a fraction of the normal speed. The wires were frayed. The insulation was gone. The breakthrough came when the doctors stopped looking at the biology and started looking at the biography. They interviewed the patients about their lives. They realized that every single patient, without exception, worked at the QPP plant. But the correlation was even more specific. They didn't just work at the plant. They all worked at or near the head table. They were the brain blowers, the cheek trimmers, the snouters. They were the people inside the mist. The doctors requested permission to tour the factory. When they walked onto the kill floor and saw the pneumatic harvesting process, the blast of air, the slurry of liquefied brain, the fine pink fog hanging over the station, the hypothesis clicked into place. This was not a viral outbreak. This was an industrial poisoning. The mechanism of the disease, which would eventually be named progressive inflammatory neuropathy, PIN, is a testament to the biological dangers of breaking the species barrier. The pig brain contains a protein structure that is nearly identical to human neural tissue. When the workers inhaled the aerosolized pig brain, their immune systems launched a massive attack against the foreign protein. The friendly fire occurred because the antibodies, in their blind fury to destroy the pig protein, could not distinguish between the invader and the host. They attacked the workers' own peripheral nerves, specifically the nerve roots where they exit the spinal cord. It was a form of biological cannibalism triggered by industrial negligence. The body was eating itself alive because it had been tricked by the air it breathed. The tragic irony was that the workers' immune systems were doing exactly what they were designed to do: protect the body from foreign matter. But in the context of the brain blower, that protection became a death sentence. The nerve damage was severe and in many cases irreversible. The myelin sheath can regenerate, but if the axon, the core of the nerve, is damaged, the loss is permanent. The workers were left with chronic pain, weakness, and a permanent reduction in their quality of life. They had traded their nervous systems for a paycheck that barely covered their rent. While these workers lost the ability to walk, the Hormel Family Trust Fund continued to grow. This is the brilliance of the dynasty's design: total separation. The heirs didn't have to see the zombie walk or smell the pink mist. The suffering was contained within the subcontractor, but the profits flowed directly to the family vault, clean and untainted by the neurological nightmare creating them. For the workers, the diagnosis was a moment of supreme psychological violation. They realized that their job wasn't just breaking their backs, it was rewriting their biology. The substance they handled every day, the product they were told to harvest for profit, had invaded them. They were carrying the ghosts of the pigs in their blood. The realization rippled through the immigrant community in Austin. The head table, once a coveted spot because it was slightly warmer than the freezer section, was now seen as a radioactive zone. But even with the diagnosis, the fear of unemployment was stronger than the fear of paralysis. Many workers tried to hide their symptoms, taping their wrists to hold their knives, dragging their numb legs to the line, terrified that if they admitted they were sick, the company would discard them just as it discarded the empty skulls of the hogs. They were trapped in a cycle of biological and economic exploitation, waiting for the fog to finally claim them completely. When the medical verdict came down from the Mayo Clinic, confirming that the aerosolized brain matter was indeed the pathogen destroying the nervous systems of the workforce, the Hormel Corporation did not recoil in horror. It retreated behind a fortress of paperwork. The forensic architecture of the relationship between Hormel and Quality Pork Processors, QPP, revealed its true purpose in this moment of crisis. To the naked eye, the two entities were one. They shared a physical wall, a steam pipe system, and a loading dock. The pigs entered the QPP side, were slaughtered and cut, and the meat traveled on a conveyor belt through a hole in the wall to the Hormel side to be canned as SPAM. But in the eyes of the law, that hole in the wall was an impenetrable border. QPP was technically an independent subcontractor. This meant that the men and women paralyzed by the brain blower were not Hormel employees. They were the liability of QPP. This distinction was the ultimate firewall. Hormel, the multi-billion-dollar parent, the entity with the deep pockets, and the global brand, could claim plausible deniability. They could issue statements expressing concern for the workers of their partner while legally distancing themselves from the negligence that caused the outbreak. It was a masterclass in risk externalization. Hormel owned the hog, they owned the final product, and they reaped the profit from the sale of the brains to Asia. But they did not own the risk. The risk was sequestered in the smaller Shield company. If QPP went bankrupt from lawsuits, the Hormel empire would remain untouched. This legal sleight of hand allowed the dynasty to maintain its pristine image as a philanthropic pillar of the Midwest, while the dirty work of managing a mass occupational injury was handled by the subcontractor. The Hormel family that J.C. Hormel had built was now a gated community, and the workers breathing the pink mist were strictly outside the gate. The response to the outbreak was a study in cold, actuarial damage control. QPP eventually stopped the pneumatic harvesting of brains, but the damage to the workers was already done. The question now was not how to cure them. Nerve damage of this magnitude is often permanent, but how cheaply they could be silenced. The legal battles that ensued were asymmetric warfare. On one side were immigrant workers, many of them with limited English proficiency, terrified of deportation and suffering from debilitating pain. On the other side were corporate legal teams armed with the finest medical experts and infinite billable hours. The settlements offered to the victims were grotesquely disproportionate to the scale of the injury. Men who had lost the ability to walk without pain, who could no longer lift their children, who faced a lifetime of medical bills, were offered settlements that often amounted to less than a year's wages. In the forensic ledger of the company, a destroyed nervous system was just another line item, a cost of doing business akin to a broken conveyor belt or a spoiled batch of meat. The total payout for the dozens of workers affected was a microscopic fraction of the revenue generated by the plant in a single week. There was no admission of systemic wrongdoing. The company framed the pin outbreak as a medical mystery, a freak occurrence of nature, rather than the predictable result of turning a skull into a pressure cooker. By controlling the narrative, they prevented the outbreak from becoming a national scandal that would threaten the Hormel brand. The workers were paid just enough to keep them from starving, but not enough to restore their lives. They were given small checks and quiet non-disclosure agreements, effectively purchasing their silence along with their nervous systems. The most brutal phase of the crisis was not the illness itself, but the disposal of the infected. Once the workers were diagnosed and their condition stabilized, often leaving them with permanent disabilities, the ruthless logic of the production line reasserted itself. In a slaughterhouse, every component must be functional. A knife must be sharp, a gear must turn, a worker must be able to stand for 8 hours and make a cut every 3 seconds. The workers suffering from PIN could no longer meet these physical demands. Their hands were too numb to hold the knives safely. Their legs were too weak to stand on the slick concrete. Under the harsh rules of at-will employment and workers' compensation laws, once a worker reaches maximum medical improvement and can no longer perform their essential job duties, the company is under no obligation to keep them. One by one, the victims of the neural fog were purged from the payroll. They were called into HR offices and told that since they could no longer do the job, they were being let go. It was a Kafkaesque nightmare. They were fired because they were injured, and they were injured because of the job they were fired from. The company did not find them alternative roles in the offices or the control rooms. Those jobs were for a different class of people. The laborers were viewed as biological machines that had broken down. When a machine breaks, you don't keep it. You scrap it and buy a new one. The parking lot of QPP filled up with new cars driven by new immigrants, Somalis, Sudanese, and others, who took the places of the crippled Mexicans. The cycle of extraction continued without a hiccup. The disposable bodies of the PIN victims were left to drift into poverty, relying on family or disability checks, their broken bodies living testaments to the price of a can of pork brains. While this tragedy was unfolding in the grim gray winter of Austin, the Hormel family and the executive class continued their ascent. The years of the PIN outbreak were years of record profitability for the corporation. The stock price climbed. The dividends were distributed on schedule. The old money philanthropy continued to flow to the opera houses and the universities. There is no record of a Hormel heir visiting the homes of the paralyzed workers. There is no record of a charitable trust being set up to care for the children of the men who lost their ability to walk. The dissociation was absolute. The neural fog stayed within the confines of the factory walls. It did not drift into the boardrooms. This era solidified the modern identity of the Hormel dynasty. They had successfully transitioned from the hands-on butchers of the 19th century to the hands-off capital managers of the 21st. They had insulated themselves from the biological reality of their own product. The PIN outbreak proved that they could survive a biohorror event that physically consumed their workforce. They simply used the legal firewall of the subcontractor to absorb the blast, just as the skull absorbed the air pressure. The corporation was now an entity of pure financial abstraction, immune to the consequences of its physical operations. Today, the brain blower is silent at QPP, replaced by different methods or discontinued at that specific site, but the legacy of the mist remains. The workers who survived are still there, living in the shadows of the town, walking with the telltale gait of the nerve damaged. They are the ghosts of the head table. But the industry did not learn a moral lesson. It learned a legal one. It learned that the subcontractor model works. It learned that immigrant labor is the ultimate shock absorber for industrial negligence. And as the memory of the neural fog began to fade, a new generation of executives looked at the profit margins and asked the eternal question, how can we make it cheaper? The answer would lead them away from the biology of the brain and toward the exploitation of the most vulnerable resource of all. The fog had cleared, but in the darkness of the night shift, a new crime was being prepared. The machines were hungry, and they were about to be fed by the hands of children. Who really cleans the head splitters at 3 a.m.? To witness the final and most depraved layer of the Hormel legacy, one must wait until the sun sets over the flat, corn-fed horizon of the Midwest and the second shift whistle blows. At 11 p.m., the roar of the kill floor subsides. The disassembly lines stop moving. The 1,300 hogs per hour cease their march toward oblivion. The brain blowers and the bandsaws fall silent. But the factory does not sleep. It undergoes a forensic transformation. The production workers, the men and women who slice the meat, clock out and leave, passing a different army coming in through the turnstiles. This is the sanitation crew, the graveyard shift. Their job is to erase the evidence of the day's slaughter. They must scrub the blood, the fat, and the bone marrow from the stainless steel machinery so that the killing can resume at dawn in a pristine environment. For decades, this was dangerous, high-paying work performed by union men. But in the fractured economy of the 2020s, the sanitation shift had become a shadow world, populated by the invisible and the vulnerable. And in late 2022, federal investigators discovered that among these nocturnal ghosts, wearing oversized rubber aprons and wielding hoses of pressurized poison, were children. The investigation by the Department of Labor, which exploded into the public consciousness in 2023, revealed a crime scene that seemed to belong to the era of Charles Dickens or the early Industrial Revolution, not the era of the iPhone and the ESG report. At Hormel plants and other meatpacking facilities across the Midwest, investigators found over 100 children, some as young as 13, working the sanitation shift. These were not teenagers flipping burgers at a fast food joint for pocket money. These were children performing hazardous occupations under federal law, working overnight shifts of 8 to 10 hours, surrounded by some of the most lethal industrial machinery on the planet. They were cleaning the head splitters, the massive hydraulic jaws used to crack open skulls. They were scrubbing the neck breakers and the bone saws. They were crawling inside the spiral conveyors to chip away solidified fat. The forensic reality of their labor is a staggering indictment of the modern supply chain. The cheapness of the pork on the American dinner table was being subsidized by the sleep, the health, and the skin of middle schoolers. The primary weapon of the sanitation crew is not a broom, but chemistry. To sanitize a slaughterhouse requires aggressive industrial-grade solvents capable of dissolving protein and lipid biofilms that adhere to the metal. The chemicals used, typically strong acids, chlorine blends, and quaternary ammonium compounds, are caustic. In forensic toxicology, a caustic substance is defined by its ability to destroy living tissue upon contact. It burns, it corrodes, and it eats. The children working the night shift were handling these chemicals often with inadequate protection or training. They were spraying high-pressure hoses of boiling water mixed with corrosives into the gears of the machines. The inevitable result was chemical trauma. School nurses in the towns surrounding these plants began to notice a disturbing pattern. Children were coming into the clinic not with scraped knees or playground bruises, but with caustic burns on their hands and forearms. The skin was red, raw, and peeling, the characteristic sign of exposure to industrial cleaners. These injuries were forensic markers of their secret lives. A 13-year-old boy does not get a chemical burn from doing homework. He gets it from handling a bucket of acid in a slaughterhouse at 3 a.m. The physical toll went beyond the skin. The fatigue was crushing. Teachers reported students falling asleep in class, unable to keep their heads up, their bodies exhausted from working a graveyard shift before coming to school. They were living in a state of chronic sleep deprivation, their development stunted by the demands of the factory. They were the sawdust children, coated in the residue of the bone dust they swept up, their childhoods dissolving in the same solvents used to clean the kill floor. Consider the gruesome irony. The Hormel family name shines on library wings and human rights awards across America, celebrated for its progressive values. Yet inside the factory that bears that same name, the machinery was being scrubbed by the blistered hands of exploited children. The family's legacy of high culture was literally being subsidized by a return to Dickensian child labor. The danger was not limited to the chemicals. The machinery itself was a dormant predator. The Department of Labor's investigation specifically noted that children were tasked with cleaning power-driven meat processing machines. These are machines designed to slice through muscle and bone with zero resistance. Even when turned off, the blades are razor sharp. Cleaning them requires a high degree of dexterity and caution, qualities that the adolescent brain, which is still developing risk assessment capabilities, often lacks. Investigators found 13-year-olds cleaning the head splitters, machines that operate with thousands of pounds of hydraulic pressure. A slip of the hand on a soapy floor, an accidental activation of a switch, or a moment of inattention due to exhaustion could result in catastrophic amputation or death. There is a hideous irony in the specific machines these children were cleaning. The head splitter is the successor to the manual cleaver. It is the machine that prepares the skull for the brain, harvesting we analyzed in Part 3. So, we have a forensic continuity of horror. The station that destroyed the nervous systems of the adult workers with neural fog was being cleaned by the hands of children. The machine consumes the health of the adult by day and endangers the life of the child by night. It is an altar of industry that demands a sacrifice from every generation that touches it. The children were crawling into the belly of the beast to shine its teeth, ensuring that the machine was ready to eat again the next morning. Who were these children? They were not the sons and daughters of the white middle-class residents of Austin who benefited from the Hormel Foundation scholarships. They were the children of the new proletariat, indigenous Guatemalans, Hondurans, and Mexicans. Many were unaccompanied minors who had crossed the border fleeing poverty and violence, only to fall into the debt bondage of smugglers and sponsors. They were the most vulnerable population in America, invisible, voiceless, and terrified of deportation. They worked under false names, using fake IDs that the companies barely scrutinized. They were the perfect disposable workforce. The presence of these children on the sanitation crews was not an accident. It was a structural necessity of the low-cost model. The sanitation contracts had been squeezed so tight, the margins pushed so low, that the only way to turn a profit was to hire labor that was illegal and desperate. The sawdust children were the final variable in the equation of efficiency. They were cheaper than adults, they didn't complain, and they didn't unionize. They were effectively ghost workers. In the eyes of the corporate structure, they did not exist. But their burns were real, their exhaustion was real, and the risk they faced every night was a violation of every labor law enacted since the 1930s. The Hormel plant, a bastion of modern food safety standards, was being sanitized by a workforce that belonged in a Upton Sinclair novel. For months, perhaps years, this practice continued in the dark. The executives at Hormel arrived in the morning to a clean factory, the stainless steel gleaming under the fluorescent lights. They did not ask who cleaned it. They did not ask why the cleaning crew looked so young. They simply accepted the cleanliness as a service provided, a line item on a budget. This is the ultimate moral dissociation. The cleanliness of the factory, a prerequisite for food safety and brand reputation, was purchased with the reckless endangerment of children. The cleanliness was a lie. The floors were sterile, but the money paying for them was dirty. When the investigators finally raided the plants, flashing their badges and interviewing the terrified children in Spanish, the veil was lifted. The graveyard shift was exposed as a dungeon of child labor. The findings shattered the illusion that such practices had been banished to the developing world. Here, in the heartland of America, in the shadow of the Spam Museum, children were doing the work of men. They were the fuel for the sanitation cycle, burning their skin and their futures to ensure that the production line could start on time. The sawdust children were not just victims of a rogue contractor. They were victims of a system that viewed them as biological debris, expendable components in the great machine of meat. In the forensic anatomy of the modern corporation, the most valuable asset is not the factory, the patent, or the brand. It is the liability shield. Following the catastrophic lesson of the P9 strike in the 1980s, And the pin outbreak in the 2000s, the Hormel Corporation refined its survival strategy into a perfect legal art form. They realized that the most dangerous aspect of meatpacking was not the knife or the bacteria, but the worker. The worker is a source of risk. They get injured, they get sick, they form unions, and occasionally they turn out to be 13 years old. To neutralize this risk, Hormel and the other giants of the industry adopted a strategy of total outsourcing for their most hazardous operations. They turned to a company called Packers Sanitation Services Incorporated, or PSSI. PSSI acts as the industrial sin eater for the American food supply chain. The relationship mirrors the legal firewall established with QPP decades earlier, a contractual air gap designed for willful blindness. Hormel pays for a clean plant, but how PSSI achieves that cleanliness and whom they hire is legally walled off from the boardroom. It allows the executives in Austin to look at a clean floor and see only hygiene, while deliberately ignoring the human exploitation required to scrub it. When the Department of Labor investigators found over 100 children working for PSSI in plants owned by Hormel, JBS, and Tyson, they were not just uncovering a labor violation, they were exposing the structural intent of the outsourcing model. PSSI existed to break the law so that Hormel didn't have to. When the scandal broke in early 2023, the reaction from the Hormel corporate headquarters was a scripted performance of moral outrage. They issued statements expressing shock and disappointment. They declared a zero-tolerance policy for child labor. They claimed they had no knowledge that the cleaners scouring their bone saws in the middle of the night were minors. Forensically, this claim of ignorance collapses under the weight of operational reality. A meatpacking plant is not a public park. It is a high-security environment. It is a panopticon of surveillance. There are cameras covering every angle of the kill floor to monitor food safety and prevent theft. There are security guards at the gates. There are Hormel managers and quality assurance inspectors who walk the floor during shift changes. The idea that a population of children, short of stature, with adolescent features and the characteristic awkwardness of youth, could operate heavy machinery for months without a single Hormel employee noticing is a statistical impossibility. It requires a collective enforced hallucination. The shock was not that children were working there. The shock was that the firewall had failed. The outsourcing model relies on the premise that the client does not look too closely at the contractor's badge. It relies on a don't ask, don't tell culture where the only metric that matters is the completion of the job. If PSSI could clean the plant cheaper than a unionized crew, Hormel did not ask why it was cheaper. They accepted the price, and in doing so, they accepted the methodology. The presence of children was not a glitch in the system. It was the inevitable result of driving labor costs down to a point where only the most desperate and vulnerable, the undocumented minor, would accept the wage. Why were children cleaning the slaughterhouse? The answer is not simply evil, it is math. The post-pandemic economy of the 2020s created a massive labor shortage in the United States. Adults were no longer willing to work the graveyard shift in a freezing, blood-soaked abattoir for low wages. The turnover rate for sanitation crews hovered near 100%. To maintain their margins, PSSI needed a workforce that was compliant, immobile, and invisible. Unaccompanied migrant children fit this profile perfectly. They were in debt to smugglers. They were often supporting families back home in Guatemala or Honduras. They were terrified of authority, and crucially, they were cheap. By hiring minors, PSSI, and by extension Hormel, was tapping into a pre-industrial labor market. They were resurrecting the ghost of the 19th century. These children did not demand overtime. They did not file OSHA complaints when their skin was burned by caustic chemicals. They did not demand health insurance. They were the perfect frictionless components for the just-in-time supply chain. The economic logic is brutal. The lower the cost of sanitation, the higher the margin on the can of Spam. Every dollar saved on a cleaner's wage is a dollar added to the dividend payout. The child labor scandal was the final proof that the old money stability of the Hormel dynasty was being subsidized by a return to the darkest impulses of unregulated capitalism. The progress of the last century, the labor laws, the safety standards, the unions, had been eroded by the solvent of outsourcing until the industry was back where it started, consuming the youth of the poor to feed the appetite of the rich. The resolution of the PSSI scandal offered the final cynical lesson in corporate accountability. The Department of Labor levied its maximum civil penalty against PSSI, $1.5 million. This amounted to approximately $15,138 for each child employed illegally. To a company with billions in revenue, this was not a punishment. It was a rounding error. It was a toll booth on the road to profit. There were no criminal charges filed against the executives of PSSI or Hormel. No one went to prison for handing a 13-year-old a hose of acid. The corporate veil held firm. Hormel specifically paid nothing. Because they were not the direct employer, they were legally insulated from the fine. Their stock price dipped briefly due to the bad press, then recovered. They announced they would reevaluate their contracts and implement stricter audits, a bureaucratic reshuffling that signaled business as usual. The outsourcing of guilt had worked exactly as designed. PSSI took the reputational hit, paid the nominal fine, and the machine kept turning. The children were fired, sent back to the shadows, likely to find dangerous work elsewhere, and the plants were restaffed. The system had successfully metabolized the scandal. The legal structure that Richard Knowlton and his successors built had proven to be immune to moral shaming. It demonstrated that in the modern American economy, you can have a supply chain paved with the burnt skin of children, and as long as you hired a subcontractor to lay the pavement, your hands are clean. This episode reveals the total collapse of the Hormel family ethos. George Hormel, the founder, believed in knowing his workers by name. J.C. Hormel believed in profit sharing. The modern dynasty believes in plausible deniability. The distance between the name on the can and the reality of the floor is now infinite. The PSSI scandal was the final severance. It proved that the brand is no longer a guarantor of quality or ethics. It is a mask. Behind the mask is a labyrinth of contracts, subcontracts, and shell companies designed to extract value from human bodies while deflecting liability for their destruction. The sin eater absorbed the fine, the dynasty kept the profit, and the children were swept away like the sawdust on the floor, leaving no trace in the annual report. In June 2021, James C. Hormel, the grandson of the founder and the moral patriarch of the modern dynasty, died at the age of 88. His obituaries in the New York Times and the Washington Post were glowing tributes to a life of extraordinary consequence. They celebrated him as the first openly gay United States ambassador, a tireless champion of LGBTQ+ rights, a philanthropist who endowed libraries, and a man of deep culture and sensitivity. He was the good king of the legacy, the proof that the Hormel name stood for progress and humanity. Yet, a forensic overlay of his death against the operational reality of his empire reveals a jarring dissonance. At the very moment the eulogies were being read in the marble halls of San Francisco and Washington, D.C., celebrating his compassion for the marginalized, The night shift at the factories that bore his name was being staffed by the most marginalized human beings in America, the 13-year-old migrant children cleaning the bone saws. This temporal collision is the defining characteristic of the Hormel dynasty in the 21st century. It is the perfection of the aristocratic split. James Hormel was not a hypocrite in his own mind. He was simply the beneficiary of a system designed to keep the source of the wealth invisible to the spender. The dividends that funded his advocacy for human rights were generated by a machine that systematically violated the human rights of its workforce. The money that built the James C. Hormel LGBTQIA Center at the San Francisco Public Library was scrubbed clean by the legal air gaps and the subcontractor firewalls we have analyzed. The clean money of the air is chemically identical to the dirty money of the kill floor. It has simply been laundered through enough layers of corporate bureaucracy to remove the smell of chlorine and singed hair. The sawdust children are the latest fuel source, fed into the furnace to keep the lights on in the mansion. The tragedy is not just that the family doesn't know, it's that the system is designed so they never have to ask. The moral dissociation is the ultimate luxury good. It allows the heirs to believe they are in the business of feeding the world, when in reality, they are in the business of consuming their neighbors. As we close this case file, we return to the object that started it all, the can of SPAM. Sitting on a pantry shelf, it is an object of mid-century modern design, colorful, nostalgic, and seemingly innocent. But forensically, it is a black box of American industrial history. If we could decode the molecular structure of that pink brick, we would find more than just pork shoulder, water, sugar, and sodium nitrite. We would find the forensic markers of every crime we have investigated. We would find the phantom limb pain of the 1980s striker, the autoimmune antibodies of the 2000s brain harvester, and the chemical residue of the 2020s child laborer. The genius of J.C. Hormel was not that he invented a new meat. It was that he invented a perfect hiding place. He created a product that obliterated the origin. When you look at a pork chop, you see the pig. When you look at Spam, you see the brand. The brand acts as a hermetic seal, locking the horror inside the tin and presenting a clean, shiny surface to the consumer. The global success of Spam is a testament to the world's willingness to accept the convenience of the product while ignoring the misery of the process. The Hormel dynasty has survived wars, depressions, strikes, and plagues. They have outlived the pigs, the unions, and the scandals. They have proven that in the American empire of food, the most important survival trait is not compassion, but insulation. The family has successfully retreated from the blood. They have become pure capital, floating above the messy biological reality of their own business. They have achieved the dream of every industrialist, a factory that runs on the bodies of the disposable, generating profits for the untouchable. The sawdust children were eventually fired, sent back into the night to find other dangerous work. The QPP workers with the zombie walk are mostly dead or forgotten, living on disability checks in the crumbling corners of the Midwest. The P9 strikers are old men now, their anger softened by time, but their scars still aching in the winter cold. But the machine keeps running. The head splitters are still cracking skulls. The brain blowers have evolved into new forms of extraction, and the Hormel family remains the benevolent aristocracy of the Corn Belt, their hands spotless, their conscience clear, and their bank accounts full. The autopsy is complete. The cause of death for the American dream in Austin, Minnesota, was not a single fatal blow, but a slow, century-long bleed, drained by a vampire that smiles like a philanthropist. The file is closed, but the factory whistle still blows, calling the next generation to the line.